In this lesson, we are going to talk about teaching philosophy statements. One way to explain what a teaching philosophy statement is as a self-reflective essay that articulates your conceptions of teaching and learning in your discipline and how you implement these in your class. So let's break this down a bit. A teaching philosophy statement is self-reflective in that it really involves reflecting on your own personal approach to teaching and learning. This is one case where you are expected to really dig deep and share your own, not somebody else's perspective, your own thoughts and feelings. And it articulates your conceptions of teaching and learning. We often have a good gut feeling of what our conceptions of teaching and learning are, but it can be really difficult to articulate that and put it into words. But by doing so in a statement, it really helps you to identify and clarify what those conceptions are in your discipline. So, teaching philosophy statements tend to be somewhat discipline specific, valuing certain aspects of teaching and learning given what discipline you come from, and expressing in a way how certain things are presented in a written narrative. For that reason, it can be really helpful to look at examples of philosophy statements that come from your own discipline. Ask those in your department or your college for examples of their teaching philosophy statements. And how you implement these conceptions of teaching and learning in your class. In your teaching philosophy statement, you don't want to just talk about your beliefs and conceptions. You need to be able to show how you implement them. And this brings us to the points below. Don't just tell, also show. Provide evidence and give actual examples that show how your teaching style helps students. Tell stories in your teaching philosophy statement. Give specific examples of what has transpired in your class, actual cases where your teaching made a difference. A really fabulous resource for helping with the construction of a teaching philosophy statement is a publication by Nancy Chism, which I have included a citation for below and will also link to in our weekly guide. In her article, Chism describes 5 essential components of every teaching philosophy statement. Basically, if you can identify these 5 components for yourself and your teaching, then your teaching philosophy statement will write itself. Let's take a look at each of these. So, number 1, conceptualization of learning. We often know this intuitively, but it can really take some effort to articulate it. It can be helpful to simply stop and think about what you believe happens during a learning episode. And this can be based on observation of the students in your class, your own personal experience as a student, or on research you may have read or heard about. Really helpful can be to come up with a metaphor to represent your conceptualization of learning. You can think of learning as a journey that a student embarks on, or it can be about why education is the kindling of a flame rather than the filling of an empty vessel. Then, given your conceptualization of learning from the student standpoint, your conceptualization of teaching from the instructor's perspective can follow. If you have a metaphor that you are using, you can start to think about where the instructor fits in. If you are using the learning as a journey metaphor, then the instructor might be a guide on the side. Another metaphor that I have read about that really emphasizes the role of the instructor is that of students giving birth to knowledge and the instructor as a midwife, helping the student to give birth to that knowledge. Now, for me personally, as incredible as the field of midwifery is, that metaphor just elicits images that I prefer not to associate with my conception of teaching and learning, but to each their own. When I mentioned this to a group of nurses, they thought it was fabulous. Anyway, for your conceptualization of teaching, ask yourself what you believe to be the role of the instructor in things like motivation and content, feedback and assessment. Discuss in your teaching philosophy statement whether the instructor's role is to challenge or support, to respond to different learning styles. Once again, this can be based on experience as a teacher, as a student, or from research. Next, we have goals for students. What in general are the goals that you have for the students you teach? And think beyond the content that you teach for a given course and focus on things like critical thinking, writing, if that's key in your field, working with others. And you may have lifelong goals for your students to stoke their intellectual curiosity, for them to lead ethical lives and have productive careers. And next we have the implementation of your philosophy. In other words, how do your concepts of teaching and learning and goals for students translate into action? This is where you want to be sure to include actual specific examples. Maybe you want to talk about that aha moment you had as a teacher when you realized something earth-shattering about teaching and learning. Or maybe it's the aha moment one of your students had after you spent some time working with them. Or you may want to talk about how you conduct classes or how you mentor students, how you grade performance. There may even be some instructional resources you have developed that have proved to be beneficial to your students' learning. And finally, you want to be sure to include some sort of personal growth plan. How have you grown in teaching over the years, including current challenges you are facing, long-term goals you have for yourself, how your conceptualizations of teaching and learning and your actions have changed over time? Talk about your vision of the teacher you want to become. Show that you have been reflective and purposeful in your teaching. And if you don't yet have a lot of experience teaching, this can all follow from your experience as a student. Talk about what you have discovered about teaching and learning from the student perspective and what your vision and goals are for your personal growth plan as an instructor. So, as you are working on your teaching philosophy statement, see if you can identify each of these 5 elements. They don't necessarily have to appear in this order, but do make sure that all 5 are present within your statement.